Well, welcome, Laura. We're so glad to have you here today.
Thank you. I am glad to be back after a week in Las Vegas.
Well, tell us about that. We were at our Restaurant Finance and Development Conference and Food on Demand Conference last week in Vegas. Tell us a little bit about what you were hearing from restaurant operators and others there.
Yes, myself and the editorial team were running around like crazy doing in-person interviews, for the first time in forever. It was so wonderful to be face-to-face with franchisees and with executives on the franchisor side and really getting, the inside story of what their restaurant operations have been like over the last year. And, what stood out to me initially was just the general enthusiasm, people glad to be back, which was wonderful, people excited to talk about their development plans and what they have coming down the pipeline. But really quickly, the conversation, of course, turned to labor and wages. And that was, that came up in, I think, just about every interview that we did, and it came up in just about every panel. And, across the board, and I don't think this is a surprise to anyone, operators are paying well above minimum wage and most well above, that $15 mark. And so now it comes down to trying to figure out, okay, how to keep these people. That came up a lot in conversations, and really what I heard, and this is something that's been developing, over the last few years, is restaurant employees, they want to feel like, they're making a difference in their day-to-day role, and they want to know what the next step is for them at that given restaurant company. And so what I heard a lot from operators was their focus on developing a career path and developing things like incentive pay, sharing P&Ls with general managers and giving them more an inside look of what's going on with operations, and then bonusing off of that. And so a lot more transparency than I think that we've seen in recent years. And so far it seems like that is, delivering some results for operators. It's still a very difficult market out there for employees, but those that are, setting themselves apart in this way, I think are feeling more comfortable and more confident in their development plans going forward. So that was awesome to hear.
One of the panels that I did at Restaurant Finance and Development Conference was with senior lenders. And interestingly, you were talking about the human side or the human capital side of the restaurant business. And he was saying on our panel, one of the leaders of a restaurant group at a bank was saying that the chief people officer is now coming to the meetings with the bankers because the bankers need to understand where they are with human resources. So I just thought that was really interesting, and that's never really a person that they've met with before, but they're seeing that more, and they're getting an idea from that chief people officer what they're doing to move the brand forward as far as labor goes. So I thought that was really interesting.
And if operators, I think virtually all of them are paying attention to this now, but if they're not, this is really something that they need to be thinking about when it comes to actually keeping employees, especially when they want to open those next few restaurants, or in the case of a lot more operators, adding a second, third, fourth brand to their portfolio, and having these opportunities for people to move up in the company. That's a big reason even why I heard from operators that they were looking to add brands to their portfolio, is because they've got this bench of, great people maybe at a senior level that they then want to move, so they have their next challenge and next opportunity. And, the labor component, of course, was key in one of the concepts that I heard more about at the conference, which is Taffer's Tavern. We had the pleasure of having John Taffer speak as one of our keynoters, and then I sat down with him for an additional interview. And when he was creating his Taffer's Tavern concept, he was really thinking back in 2018, 2019 about this coming labor crunch. And so he spent a lot of time working on a really streamlined back of the house and a sous vide cooking technique that is involved in all the kitchens, where they can have 2 to 3 people in the kitchen versus 5 or 6 in a typical casual dining format. And so that, cuts the labor costs. And it was really interesting. He signed several multi-unit agreements before they even had their first restaurant open. The first restaurant opened last fall in Georgia. And it's been, he, of course, has that name recognition and has that
from
going
Bar
for
Rescue,
him.
his show
from Bar Rescue, his show on Paramount Network. And he is, the 100% owner of the company. He, emphasized to me that he doesn't have to answer to anyone else, basically. And so people have a lot of trust in him and in his brand to sign on with that. And of course, now they've got additional, restaurants that they've got leases signed and they're under construction. But of course, it is always interesting to to see how many of those units end up getting developed. But it sounds like he and his team have the backing to do so, to get it done. A couple other conversations that I had with operators. One, I was able to sit down with Chris Dahl, who is the new CEO of Freddy's Frozen Custard and Steak Burgers. They were acquired by a private equity firm earlier this year, and then he came in May as the new CEO, taking over for one of the co-founders, Randy Simon. And, after we talked about, the updates and the investments and some of the things that they're planning on doing with their capital, I was asking him, what does it take to really have a successful relationship with a private equity firm? And he had previously been with Global Franchise Brands. And so he'd worked with multiple private equity buyers in the past. And he said, really, it came down to, even as the CEO, him checking his ego at the door and understanding that, he's on the operation side, but people on the private equity side, they're coming in with different levels of expertise in different areas, and being open to that input is really what it takes to make a successful relationship. It goes much beyond the initial investment that a private equity firm is making. So people will have to read more of that coverage on our website, franchisetimes.com. Myself and the rest of our editorial team were furiously writing all through last week, and we'll continue to do so to provide coverage from the conference. And I think we'll have some videos too of the different sessions available.
So we will. There was a lot going on at the conference with what you were saying, talking about labor and supply chain issues. And really, I think the good thing about the conference, and what I heard, the good news for operators, because that's the bad news and that's hard, but the good news is there's lots of capital available for good operators. And I think there's more lenders in the space, and they're competing, and mergers and acquisitions are going to continue, and people are paying high multiples for businesses. So for operators, it was a mixed bag of what we've been talking about today. So, but a lot of good news there as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. And QSR, of course, has gotten so much attention, through the pandemic, and those brands with drive-throughs, and, how they were in a better position than others to keep, their doors open. But I think, and I heard this in a few of the sessions that I attended more on the finance side, is that, there are lenders out there doing casual dining deals. They're not, that is something that is starting to come back as a lot of those brands, did things differently with their off-premises business through the last year. That's becoming a bigger part of the equation. And of course, we covered that extensively on the back half of our second conference last week with the Food on Demand event. So people
tell me a little bit about that.
Absolutely. So this was our fourth year doing the Food on Demand conference, and we were, virtual last year, and of course turned in then a wonderful in-person event this year at the tail end of the Restaurant Finance and Development Conference. And this is all about the off-premises focus, as the Food on Demand name hopefully suggests. And so we had, the big delivery providers, but then even more interesting was, the whole host of virtual brand players, people that are doing the kitchens themselves, people that are developing the brands. It's just an entirely new ecosystem for restaurant operators to be thinking about. And then, not to mention convenience and grocery and all these other verticals that these delivery providers are getting into. And so on our foodondemandnews.com site, you can catch up on all of that coverage and check out some really cool videos, one of which is a drone delivery. We had Flytrex and El Pollo Loco as a couple of the presenters, and they're doing live drone deliveries with that brand, which is really cool. So what seemed very futuristic not too long ago is actually happening.
And I think the pandemic sped that up for restaurant companies, sped that up, that they had to get with it faster. I've even heard that 3 years of development time was compressed into about 6 months when they had to deal with the pandemic and getting their food delivered to folks. Let's switch gears a little bit and away from restaurants and talk about our cover story in the November-December issue. We have a woman who is leading a brand we could say there's a lot of perseverance there. And she had a private equity infusion in her company. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yep. So Ruth Agbadji is on our cover. She's the founder of CodeWiz, and she has, really, you'll have to read the story, just an incredible tale of perseverance and pushing through regardless of her circumstances. She grew up, very poor in Nigeria, and so, just hearing her path to founding and creating her own coding franchise is amazing. The brand was acquired by Tutor Doctor, and it's CodeWiz itself is only at 6 units, but she's got big plans, of course, to grow that within the Tutor Doctor network. And then elsewhere in the story, you can read about just this huge infusion of private equity dollars into the kids' education space. We've got groups like Unleashed Brands, which was formed by the group that has Urban Air Adventure Parks, and they bought Snapology. You've got Engineering for Kids, which was acquired by Launch Life International. I mean, the list goes on. And so that kids coding space in particular is going to be one to watch, and one that investment firms are paying close attention to.
That's kind of a good reminder for people when we talk about all these acquisitions, a good reminder about our deal makers that's coming up.
Yes, so nominations are open for our annual Dealmakers Awards project, and that is our look back at the previous 18 months of M&A activity in franchising, from restaurants to coding franchises. We'll be covering them all, and so people can look for information at franchisetimes.com to fill out a nomination for their deal, and then we have a separate judging process, as you know, and do a full then reporting on those winning deals in our May issue next year. So
that's pretty exciting. Yep. We always love the deal makers because it really talks about how franchising is growing and different concepts are getting that attention. Yeah,
we talk a lot about how people attract these private equity firms or attract, another franchisee buyer. It doesn't have to be a private equity or another franchise buyer.
Right.
It really runs the gamut of M&A activity. And something that we'll be spending some time on throughout this month is an additional focus on private equity's impact in franchising. So looking at, not just these deals that are getting done, but sort of what goes on behind the scenes to make it happen. And then what happens, a year later. We'll be checking back with some of our past deal makers winners on sort of where things are at now, what they've done with that capital, how has the relationship evolved, and share some of those insights with our readers this month.
I'm always impressed with our deal makers coverage and what you all do in the editorial team, because it really is also about the people side of those deals. So it's always interesting to me. So talk a little bit. We do a lot of coverage on franchisetimes.com, our digital coverage that is different than the print magazine. Tell me a little bit about what you have going on there.
Yep. So again, we've got that digital focus on private equity throughout this month. We've got our 4 wonderful newsletters each month that people can sign up for, one of which just went out today, which is our special delivery e-newsletter, and that has a lot of coverage from the conference. And then we've got The Wire, which is our multi-unit development e-newsletter, and I do a lot of that coverage. It's always great to talk with multi-unit operators about why they're getting into a new brand or why they're adding locations to their unit count. And we're excited about our digital coverage looking ahead to next month, where we'll be profiling a lot of C-suite individuals. And so looking back at people that have joined new companies at various C-level executive positions and finding out, how they got through COVID, number one. That's always going to be a big question. But then also what they've done since then to improve the performance of their brands. In franchising, of course, there's a ton of movement at that top level.
Right.
And so keeping track of who's going where and how they're applying maybe outside the industry expertise to a new franchise segment is always really interesting. So there's no shortage of great coverage online.
So we have so much going on at Franchise Times and franchisetimes.com. Laura, thank you so much for being with us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And for our audience, hold on. In a couple of moments, we'll be back with our first franchisor presentation.